So having said that, without further ado, Dr. Deborah Craton will present the history of Dunn Hospital. Thank you, Doctor.
What an intimidating group this is. First of all, thank you all for coming. I see so many faces that I haven't seen in probably a year or two, and I appreciate you all turning out for that. Second of all, don't get your hopes up. We're only going from 1903 to 1964 is all the further we're going. We're doing that for two reasons. Otherwise, we'd be here till next spring. And second of all, I wanted to stay in a time period where I had to do the research by going back to old newspaper articles, old magazine articles. There's nobody really left to talk to about the time that I'm going to be talking about, except one person, and she's in the room. She worked there part of the time we're going to talk about. So, no mentioning your name, Cindy.
She's right here.
Yeah, right here. So anyway, so Dunn Hospital is near and dear to my heart for a couple different reasons. One, yes, I worked there forever, only 38 years ago. And the other reason is because that's where my mother went to work in 1956 when we moved back to town. And so it's very near and dear to my heart. And so after it closed last year, a lot of us were heartsick about it. A lot of the artifacts, I think almost all the artifacts and the archives from the hospital came to the museum, so those have been kept. And I had the privilege of going through many of those things and trying to identify them, which was not easy because some of the things that always said in the Hannon room were from 1930, and I had no idea what some of these instruments were. So, but anyway, that's how all this got started. And so I hope that you learned something tonight and that you enjoyed the presentation. Prior to 1903, there was not a hospital in Bedford. Most of the care was taken care of in homes. Okay? If you were very, very ill, the doctor visited you at home. If you're extremely ill and the family could not take care of you, then not only did the doctor come and visit you on a daily basis, but then a nurse came into the home and took care of you. Different than home health today, okay, because you know many of us do have home health on occasion. It was different. The nurse came and stayed. Okay, so it's a little bit different. So in 1903, the Lawrence County Hospital Association started, and they were concerned. Their whole project was to get a hospital started. And prior to 1905. That hospital was right here. This is at 14th and I Street. It was a private home. Again, the doctor came there to see the patient. The nurse who took care of you in this particular home was named Lizzie Donahue. And Lizzie was considered the Florence Nightingale of Lawrence County. And that's all the information I can find about her. Okay? But that was her job, and she took care of all the patients that came there. Not very many. There's usually 2 or 3 at a time. Okay? Now, I've been given... Oh, there. Now, that's the hospital most people recognize as being the first hospital in Bedford. In April 1st, which is sort of odd, April 1st of 1905, this property was purchased. This is at 708 16th Street. It's the house across the street from Crowder's. And that's where most people remember that the hospital was started. The name was given City Hospital. It was for the indigent and for those who were unable to receive care in their home. So if they could not be at home and somebody take care of them, they came to, quote, City Hospital. Lizzie Donahue was again the head nurse there. Mrs. Hubich, H-U-B-I-C-H, was the superintendent. She was in charge of finances such as they were at that time. There were 2 doctors who provide most of the care. They were general practitioners, but they did a little bit of everything, including surgery. That was Dr. Freeland and Dr. Short. And I think many of you have probably heard those names over the years. In October of 1905, Bedford City Council decided that they could contribute money to the hospital. They contributed all of $25 a month. Now, in today's money, that would be $870 a month. That would not cover the cost of one day hospital stay for anybody in 2023. They knew before long that this facility was not going to be able to accommodate the patients that they were anticipating having. They wanted a real hospital. So in 1908, in the Brightwood edition of Bedford, which is out on 23rd Street, that property was purchased. It was known as the Rector Home, and it was described as being a deeply wooded oak grove that extended to Washington Avenue. So it would have started about where Mitchell Road is now and gone all the way over to Washington Avenue. So, and then 23rd Street was on that. That property was originally bought in 1830 by Isaac Rector, and again, the original property was bought for $200 in 1830, which would have been about $6,600 today. I always think that's fascinating to look at that. So this is the Rector house. This is the house that sat on the property on 23rd Street. It was a brick home. It had 9 rooms. All right. It had one long hallway that bisected the house. It had 2 rooms on the front and 2 rooms on the back, and then a large room on the back side. The front room on the east was the parlor, and then behind it was the parlor bedroom. The room on the west was the living room, and the dining room was behind that. It was the kitchen that was across the back. There was an extended porch. There was a full basement, and the third floor, which was really what we consider the second floor, had 2 large rooms in it. So Bedford City Hospital was established in 1908. There was an organization called the Women's Hospital Aid Association, and their job was to provide all the necessities to run the hospital. They worked with several different groups to get that done. They worked with 8 specific churches here in town at the time. The primary one being the Presbyterian Church, which wanted to have its name associated with the OB room. You know, one little room, OB room. There was a group called the War Mothers, and they helped provide supplies and care for the hospital. And then there was the Sororis Club that also helped provide supplies for the hospital. On December 12, 1908, the first surgery took place in this facility. Dr. Freeland and Dr. Short performed that. It was an appendectomy. There's always an appendectomy. You all make me terribly nervous. I don't usually get nervous, but y'all have done it to me. So anyway, this gentleman is the namesake of Dunn Hospital. This is Moses Fell Dunn. Sometime prior to 1915, he established the Bedford Hospital and Monumental Association. Now, I'm going to pick on Marla for a minute. He not only wanted a hospital in Bedford, but he wanted monuments on the square, did he not? Marla, wasn't that his?
Yes, one specific one, and that's, he had seen the soldiers, sailors, and pioneers monument in another city, and was impressed by it, and wanted to be certain we had something equally as impressive here on the square in downtown Bedford.
Thank you. And so he established this organization to get that started. I'm not real sure how the hospital got mixed up with that, but that's what he wanted done.
The money was all held by the hospital.
Okay, thank you. But to receive this money when he died, and he died in 1915, he left for just the hospital $15,000. And you think, well, that's not a lot. But again, 1915, that was $454,000. But the community only got that for their hospital if they could match the funds. And they had to come up with $5,000. That's $150,000 to receive Mr. Dunn's inheritance. They were able to do that, but it was quite a struggle. In 1909, it was such a struggle to maintain monies for any hospital, especially in rural Indiana, that there was presented before the Indiana legislature a bill called the Bedford Hospital Bill in 1909. And it allowed, didn't say you had to, but it allowed that a levy could be placed on the people of the community to support the hospital if they chose to do that. That was not used for a long time, and we'll get into that in a little bit, but that money was appropriated. It could be there if we chose to use it. But Mr. Dunn's money could only be used as public money. Public money had to match that so the hospital could be built or maintained. So, 1914, 1915. Yeah, that sort of catches your eye, doesn't it? Where you went to die, not to cure. That's what people thought of hospitals in 1914, 1915. People didn't go to the hospital, okay? They preferred to stay at home. Doctors still visited. You could still get home nurses to come out. But across the nation, across the country, hospitals were increasing and they were becoming more of a value. And actually, in 1914, there was a newspaper article that called the Bedford City Hospital one of its most valuable institutions. In the last 7 months of 1914, there were 51 surgeries, there were 22 medical cases, and 5 OB cases. But even though those numbers sound big, they weren't. And again, people were still not using the hospital. They were staying at home or they went to the big city. Okay? And at that time, the big city was not Indianapolis. The big city was Louisville. Okay? Or they went to Mayo. Okay? Up in Rochester. Now, we believe that was still going on, but the Mayo brothers had established their clinic. So that was the place to go around 1914, 1915. I will stop here for a minute and just give you some statistics because I don't think people realize how much hospitals were not used. In 1900, less than 10% of births took place in a hospital. Less than 10%. Okay? By the 1940s, 26.7% of non-white and 55% of white births took place in a hospital. And even by the 1950s, 56% non-white and 88% of births, white births took place in a hospital. So even in the 1950s, there were still a lot of home births being taken care of. Okay? People still didn't trust hospitals. They just didn't. They just wouldn't put their care there. 1917, 1919. Big changes at this point. There needed to be major changes in that structure that we saw. It was still that old brick house. There was still not a lot of structure to it. It was beginning to run down. It needed a lot of remodeling and it needed to be expanded. They only had the 9 rooms, as I said. And so if they had more than 9 patients, they were crowding a lot of people in those rooms. But the expansion was going to cost, in today's money, $480,000. Did not happen. Okay? They wanted to expand it to hold 30 patients. The board at that time, and I found this extremely fascinating, the board at that time only had men. Had men, and no doctors, okay? And the thought was the hospital was a doctor's plaything. Love that? A doctor's plaything. And women weren't allowed to be on the board because they were only good for taking care of patients, not for making the decision. So they could be the nurses, they could be the superintendents, they could do the everyday work, but buddy, they could make any of the decisions. Also in 1918 is when the hospital went from being the Bedford City Hospital to Dunn Hospital. They felt they needed to give Mr. Dunn the recognition that he deserved, and so they renamed the hospital in 1918. In 1919, it is important, I think, to know that there were 81 cases of influenza. Remember, this is the Spanish influenza, okay? We had 81 cases of influenza in the hospital, only 4 deaths. That speaks highly of the care that was being taken care of them, despite the fact that that building needed to have repairs done. People still were complaining of the status of care, and there was still no financial support to the hospital. The entire board resigned in 1919. The city council said, you can't do that. They refused to accept the resignations, okay? And they agreed to give the hospital $35,000 to keep it going. Despite that money, it was, again, the community that stepped in and continued to provide support for the hospital. And most of that monies came from, again, the war mothers. At this point, the Red Cross, Tri Kappa, and Tri Kappa is still very active and involved, and Rotary Club. So these 4 community-based organizations helped the hospital continue to grow and to improve. I found an interesting article describing a baseball game between the Rotary Club and Kiwanis to raise money for the hospital. The Roaring 20s come along, okay? April 22nd, 1920, the first brain surgery was done at Dunn Hospital. Probably the first and only brain surgery. I called it a brain surgery. The newspaper called it a brain surgery. What had happened was that there was a crushed skull injury. Dr. Freeland and Dr. Short came up, still running around, came along, and they were able to lift that bone out, and the patient survived. I don't know the exact status, but he did survive. Also in the 1920s, the federal government decided that the hospital needed to take tuberculosis patients. They needed to be at the hospital. They did. They took care of them. The community was not happy. The community was so angry that as they tried to move those patients up from Louisville to Lawrence County, they barred the road and wouldn't let the patients through. So after some tussling and everything, the patients did come and they did well. In 1921, the first blood transfusion took place at that hospital. And nurses training was established at the hospital. We'll talk about this particular building in just a minute. In 1923, there was a very important man from Bedford admitted to the hospital. His name was E.B. Thornton. You recognize that last name. Mr. Thornton was hospitalized. He did okay. He came along. He went in. He came out. He was fine. But then he wrote a scathing report about the hospital. He said that the conditions were terrible. He wanted things changed. And because he was such a prominent man in the community, he was able to do that. March of 1924, the county finally heard all the problems and everything, and the county, not the city, the county finally said, okay, we'll levy the tax. We will get you $12,000 per year, okay? And in today's money, that's $215,000. And just at that one moment, they gave them a grand total of $1,800, $32,000, okay? Because they thought that's all they really needed. The city then, in July of 24, deeds the hospital to what it was known as the Dunn Hospital Association. And it operated the hospital completely until 1939. And some of you may remember the Dunn Hospital Association. Even when I was at the hospital, it still was very active in the board. It had a couple of members of the board from the association. In 1926, this building was built. This is the nurses' quarters. Okay. I had an office in this building for a short period of time. It was haunted. We can do that some year. That's a great story too. But anyway, and it also contained some of the doctor's offices. All right. In 1928, the community, the doctors, everybody became convinced that the Rector House was no longer appropriate. It was not big enough. It had to be changed. And improving just the Rector House was not going to be enough. Something else needed to be built. They needed 50 beds at least. A committee came together to try to come up with a way to do that. They investigated things. Now remember, in 1928, what happened? The crash. Okay, so keep that in mind. They could build this. And I'm just going to give you today's money. $2.7 million. But they had to have the WPA involved because it was going to be all government labor. The community was asked to raise $550,000. Okay, now at that time it was $30,000. The community came together in 1928-29, Depression time, and they raised $40,000 for their hospital. Again, the community did. Okay, the community did. And the county is still sitting on the square refusing to give any support. They refuse to give any support. Until September 7th, 1938. With enough complaints by the community, with enough complaints by physicians, by enough complaints by prominent businessmen, the county finally agreed to support the hospital. They decided that they could provide at that time $150,000. I'm talking in monies of the 1930s. They wanted to own the building. They would own the building, but they would lease the operation to Dunn Hospital Association to operate through. Okay? They owned the building, but they didn't own the business. It was at this point that Helen Boyer became the superintendent, okay, or the director. And she served in that capacity as either the administrator or superintendent until 1969. They decided they would build a new building. It would be in the same location. They hired Walter, and I'm going to have help with the last name, Scholler, I think is his last name. He was from Lafayette. It was the same gentleman who designed the courthouse. Okay? So the gentleman that designed the courthouse was hired to design the hospital on 23rd Street. By October of 39, all the monies had been raised. They had all the money they needed. The WPA even came in and said, oh, but the project isn't quite big enough for us. You need to make it bigger. Well, okay, they did. They made it bigger. They added more rooms. And interesting enough, the stone companies of Lawrence County donated all the stone. Okay. The total cost of building the hospital in 1939 dollars was $378,000. In today's money, that'd be $8 million. That's what it cost to build that hospital and supply the insides. And there she is. That is what was built in 1939. It was opened on October the 23rd of 1941. Construction was completed. There was a new board appointed, and the staff. And I was amazed by this. And Sandy, you can chime in because you'll know some of these people. Helen Boyer was the superintendent. Lillian Mayo was the head of A floor. I always heard my mother talk about Miss Mayo. Never Lillian.
She ran the pharmacy.
She ran
the pharmacy, and I know she went to my grandmother's house when she was dying and took care of her. My dad told me that.
There you go. There you go. Flores Williams was in charge of the office. Ilis Davis was the night nursing supervisor. Helen Durkee was in charge of medical floor, B floor. Again, that's another name I always heard, and it was never Miss or Mrs. Durkee, it was just Durkee. That was all she ever said. Edith Mottsinger was in charge of surgery, and Dorothea Henson was in charge of C floor. And at that time, the hospital was 3 floors, and you can, A, B, and C is what they were. The first baby was born late in 1942, I think, and he was a gentleman by the name of Thomas Miller of Mitchell. In 1946, this came out. That's Look magazine, doesn't exist anymore. Look at the title up in the right-hand corner. Life and Death in Indiana. What happened was, they wanted a first-hand look at rural medicine. And they had contacted Miss Boyer and said that they were going to come, thought they were going to give her notice, did not, and they just showed up one day. Now, you couldn't do that today for any amount of money, but they did, and they spent 2 weeks at the hospital. They wanted, quote, a first-hand look to learn firsthand what goes on in a county hospital. They spent 2 weeks. And here are some of this is what they came away with. Every patient paid either $4 minimum to an $8 a day maximum. Whether you were in a corridor or in a room, you all got the same care. During their 2 weeks here, during the 2 weeks they were here, there was 41 births, half as many deaths, and over 100 surgeries in those 2 weeks. And this is a quote from Look magazine. I think it's important because I think this is what Dunn Hospital can be summed up as. Whether it was in 1946 or whether it was in 2022. There was no resident physician, no intern, no private nurses. These luxuries the county hospital must forego. But on the credit side is a community's trust in its hospital, which would be hard matched in larger cities. The people of Bedford go to their hospital to have their children. They go there when they are sick. They have seen members of their families die there. It is their hospital, and they are justly proud of it. And I thought, well, we could have said the same thing 1 year ago. So, big changes after this. From 1948 to 1961, lots of changes took place. Okay. In 1948, they did another expansion. They added another 50 beds. That took them up to 100 beds. They added ORs. Those were up on the 5th floor. Is that right, Sandy? Is that 4th floor? The 4th floor. They added a lab. They improved X-ray. A pharmacy was designated. They added an ER. They added a boiler, and elevators were added. Now there was a rumor, and I never could confirm this, that when those elevators were being built, they didn't block those off, and somebody, I think a doctor supposedly, fell into the shaft and died. That's not a rumor, that's true?
That's true.
Going like this.
Surgery was the 5th floor.
Okay.
And he turned around, talked to someone, and stepped in, and the elevator wasn't there. And he fell. I don't remember his name, but they always told me that was true.
Now, see, I'm beginning to wonder if that's true because I cannot find any record of that.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I always heard that.
so we'll see. The record can always be changed. In 1958, kitchens and a cafeteria were added. In 1960, the boiler room was added. And I'm pretty sure that's the boiler room that most people recognize as the boiler room that's right outside the current emergency room. I'm pretty sure that's that boiler room. In 1961, Dunn Hospital had 137 full-time employees. They had served in 1961 9,813 patients, and they had 100 beds. That was 1961. They perked along pretty good, and then in 1964, everything changed. What happened in 64? Does anybody remember? Medicare. That's exactly right. Medicare, Medicaid. In other words, the federal government stepped in. All right? And the federal government said, now everybody has equal care, everybody can have everything they need, everything will be paid for in the elderly and by the indigent by the federal government. When that happened, my opinion, bared out I think by what we've seen since 1964, medicine was no longer about just taking care of the sick people and no longer about taking care of indigent and no longer taking care of what needed to be taken care of. It became a business at that point. And so it was a big change. The other thing that happened in 1964 with the onset of Medicare and Medicaid is an organization that was just sort of putzing along since 1910 called the Joint Commission, which just sort of existed. And they were accrediting hospitals, saying whether they were good or bad or whatever. In 1964, when Medicare came about, the federal government said, you can't get any payment from us unless you're accredited by the Joint Commission. They went from having a 12-page booklet to, who was the last, I don't know, see anybody in here that may have dealt with the Joint Commission last I knew, that booklet that you dealt with was like this thick, okay? So, big changes there. The last slide I have for you tonight is a quote by Helen Boyer. She made it in 1956, and I think it's something that we can take to heart tonight as we close, thinking about healthcare as a whole, not just Dunn Hospital and what happened to her, and I do that. To us, she was the great gray lady. She was just she was a great facility. But what Helen said in 1956, I think needs to be thought again because it's true. Our hospital is not merely stone and mortar containing beds. It is a symbol of a great struggle going on in the world today to preserve civilization. And I think we see that not only within the hospital, but I think we see it in many cases within our community and in everyday life. So that's it. That's until 1964. I stopped there because everything changed and everything became different. I don't know that I can answer any questions, but I'll be happy to take them. Oh dear. That's bad. That's bad. When nobody has any questions, that's bad.
Do you know why the board all resigned together that one time?
Yes, because the care was so bad and they couldn't get anybody to pay attention to it. The board kept saying, we need the money, we need the money, we need the money, and nobody was listening. And they finally decided to get everybody's attention by all resigning at the same time. And so the city said, well, you can't do that. Well, yeah, we can. But that's what. Yes, ma'am.
I did see in a ledger one time when I was born in 1935 and it was $12.
And that ledger's here, Sandy.
Yeah, it is here.
We do have many of the artifacts that were, like I said, that were in the Hannon room. Surgical instruments. There is a saddlebag by Dr. Woolry, but not the Dr. Woolry that you and I might think of. It was his ancestors, because it's from 1830, I think, is when those bags were used. And that's what they did. They went from house to house on horse or on a cart or however they got there. But very interesting. Very interesting.
We had a lot of Dr. Allen's old instruments.
Yeah.
And we're able to give them to his daughter, who gave them to her sons, who are doctors.
Oh, that's wonderful. Yeah.
And they even had his initials on them.
Oh, that's
because
wonderful.
they were engraved.
Exactly, because doctors in those days had to buy their own instruments, they had their own things, and they brought them to the hospital.
So glad that we did that happen.
Yeah. Myra?
My firstborn was in October 1962, and we were there like 2 days, and I was released to go home, and my husband came to pick us up, and we couldn't leave because we owed $11. And the lawyer said, no, you can't take her home.
Hold your baby hostage.
Well, they always told that Mrs. Boyer always knew who owed money, and that she would go on Fridays to different taverns, places around town, because she knew guys got paid, and go collect money. Now, that was passed down too, I'm not sure that's true.
I wanted to try to stick to the facts here. Well, I appreciate y'all coming out. I know many of you are here just because you were Dunn employees and we wanted to hear the history. Maybe one of these days we'll go from 65 to 22, but tonight I just felt like we really needed to look at the old history and to understand how what the hospital meant to the county. And one of the things I learned is the community involvement. You know, that's what I learned, is how much this community wanted their hospital, how much they were willing to go out and do for this hospital. And I would say even up until when I left, the community was still doing that. And so appreciate it. Appreciate y'all coming. Yeah. Take a cookie home. So we don't take one with us.
Thank you, Doctor.